LoreFactsTV.
Though not always present, Asgore is a key figure in Undertale, and his character and role echo throughout the game's narrative. Unbeknownst to new players, he is first seen as early as the game's prologue, where he is depicted as a fierce and imposing force, juxtaposed against the much smaller, yet stronger humans. He is first introduced to players directly by Toriel, and the game intentionally misleads you into believing him to be the primary antagonist of the story. But as the story progresses, further dimensions of his character are revealed to the player, culminating in a final confrontation near the end of the neutral route, which culminates, again, in a fight that expresses his internal turmoil and anguish. For a character so crucial to Undertale's storyline, it begs a question as to why he seems to be so important to Deltarune's narrative. For a story that has done a lot of work to carve out its own identity and distinguish itself from its predecessor, it seems antithetical to place so much focus on one of the previous game's primary antagonists. Yet despite that, Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4 do a lot of build up for Asgore to hold an important role in Deltarune's wider narrative, particularly in Chapter 5, with the game seemingly foreshadowing a Flower King Darkworld that Asgore seems to be heavily involved in. So why is Deltarune revisiting one of Undertale's primary antagonists? Today, we aim to answer that question. Hi, my name is Michael, and welcome back to LoreFactsTV. While we've made a few videos now on our wide-reaching expectations for Deltarune, we wanted to take a closer look at individual ideas and characters and determine how they may be used or executed in future chapters. Today, we'll be taking a close look at Asgore Dreemurr, King of the Underground in Undertale and Chris's father in Deltarune, and try to determine the role he'll play in Chapter 5 and the overall wider narrative of Deltarune. This video is greatly inspired by the Asgore running over deaths meme that's been prominent in Undertale and Deltarune community since the release of Chapters 3 and 4. While obviously just a joke theory, we wanted to give an actual explanation of what Asgore did and how it ties to December Holiday. We know it's an action Asgore took and not something he did by accident, so we can safely put aside truck theory as a viable answer. But then what is it that Asgore did that caused his life to fall apart in Deltarune? We'll explore this question through an examination of Asgore's character across both Undertale and Deltarune, analyzing the Chapter 5 teasers present in recent Deltarune chapters and presenting an in-depth theory of the role that Asgore will play in Chapter 5, along with his ties to the themes of Deltarune and the parallels he shares with major characters in the game. To fully understand the role Asgore may play in Deltarune, we must begin with the role Asgore plays in Undertale. The first time Asgore is mentioned in Undertale is when we attempt to leave the ruins. Toriel explains that if Frisk is to leave the ruins, then the monsters outside of the ruins, and more specifically, Asgore, will kill them. Later, throughout our journey through the underground, we learn that Asgore is the king of the underground and monsters, and that he intends to kill Frisk to collect their soul and break the barrier that keeps the monsters trapped underground. Asgore then aims to wage war on humanity as revenge for all the pain the humans have brought the monsters throughout the millennia of imprisonment. We also learn that at the point we have fallen into the underground, Asgore has already killed and collected the souls of 6 out of the 7 humans he needs to break the barrier. All of these things draw a foreboding picture of a violent and vengeful man, and the game sets the player's expectations that this will be the final encounter in the game. However, as the game's story unfolds, we gain another perspective on Asgore. Papyrus describes Asgore as a big fuzzy pushover, who everybody loves and would guide Frisk straight to the barrier if they only just asked, while Undyne initially reinforces the perspective of Asgore as a vicious killer during her battle as a means to intimidate Frisk. Later in her day event, she contrasts this description by likening Asgore to Frisk during the pacifist route, describing Asgore as a total weenie who wouldn't want to fight anyway. Asgore overall serves as the literal embodiment of the hopes and dreams of the population of the underground. He's deeply committed to the happiness of his people and means a great deal to everyone in the underground. When we finally meet and fight Asgore towards the end of the neutral route, we see the synthesis of the two perceptions of Asgore we've come to know during our playthrough. Asgore is ultimately a very conflicted individual who lives with a deep amount of regret and shame. He immediately comes across as the kind-hearted Asgore we've learned about, and his actions and dialogue leading up to the battle show a great deal of reluctance, almost as if he wishes Frisk to turn away and never return. Despite this, once the battle begins, it's not possible to complete this fight with just acting, as Asgore's duty to his people overshadows his reluctance to fight. Asgore starts the battle by immediately destroying the Mercy Bar, not only creating a striking and memorable moment, but possibly alluding to Asgore having a greater understanding of this world, similar to characters like Sans, Gerson, and Flowey. It's not clear whether Asgore destroys the mercy button because he doesn't want a peaceful outcome to the fight or because he believes that he is unworthy of mercy. It's also important to note that Asgore also seems to be aware of the power to reset, as Frisk can mention how many times they've died to Asgore, a fact that he acknowledges without question, likely implying the other fallen humans had this power and still couldn't get past Asgore. Asgore's battle itself feels like a battle that he wants to lose. The theme that serves as the intro to his battle is called
Bergentrekkung,
but it's a German expression for the king asleep in the mountain trope. And this trope is notable for its roots in folklore, in which a great leader or hero slumbers away or is hidden away in a mountain or mythical place, awaiting a time when they are needed to reclaim their throne, defend their kingdom, or save the world. One well-known use of this trope is Breath of the Wild, where Link slumbers in the Shrine of Resurrection before returning after 100 years to save Hyrule. Undertale both uses and deconstructs this trope through Asgore, in the most literal sense. Asgore is the king of the underground, and he, as well as the rest of the monsters, have been trapped beneath Mount Ebott for millennia. However, it also refers to how Asgore himself is stuck in a state of emotional stagnation when we meet him in Undertale. Asgore, in a moment of extraordinary anguish after losing his two children, Azrael and the fallen human, had imposed a policy to kill all humans who fell into the underground. Even though his anger subsided later, he doesn't reverse his decision after seeing how much hope it brought to his people. We also learned that his wife during this time was Toriel, and that his actions disgusted her so greatly that she left the castle and moved into the ruins. The trope is used and deconstructed by Asgore, not wanting to complete his duty, trapped by obligation and emotional stagnation. He lives with a deep amount of regret and longs for a return to days past, when he still had his wife and children by his side. Asgore uses these memories as a form of escapism. Asgore could at any point in time cross the barrier with just one human soul, collect the 6 remaining souls from any other humans, and then just free his people. Instead, he would rather live in the security of his memories and pray that another human wolf never fall into the underground. These traits strongly define Asgore will be very important when we look at his character in Deltarune. Moving past his intro theme, Asgore's battle theme, which is just named Asgore, gives more insight into the man himself. His theme contains the heartache motif. Not only directly tying him to Toriel and the longing he still feels for her, but also portraying Asgore's literal heartache and internal turmoil during the battle. After Asgore is defeated, the spare option is reconstructed, and you are once again given the choice of how you want to end the battle. Asgore pleads for Frisk to take his soul and use it to leave the underground. If you choose to spare Asgore, he expresses a great deal of hope and excitement towards a future where Frisk can stay in the underground and allow Asgore to take care of them. A future where Toriel returns to the castle and the three of them live together like a family. Typically, before Asgore could finish the speech, he's killed by Flowey. However, if the player previously killed Flowey in a neutral run, or the player does a pacifist run after completing a neutral run and restarts from the beginning of the game, Flowey does not interrupt Asgore, and we get to see the end of the speech. Following the prior interruption, Asgore realizes that the future he envisioned of caring for Frisk and his wife returning to him was just a fantasy. A life that he once knew many years ago, that he sadly cannot return to. In this moment, he likens Frisk to the fallen human, expressing his belief that Frisk is the angel from Undertale's version of the prophecy, destined to free the monsters from their prison. He sacrifices himself, allowing Frisk to take their soul, under the belief that it's what his son Azrael would have wanted. No matter what you do, Asgore will only ever survive in the true pacifist ending. Otherwise, he will always be killed by Flowey, Frisk, or himself. In the true pacifist ending, we see Asgore working as a gardener at the same school that Toriel is teaching at. It's possible he does this as a means to reconcile his relationship with Toriel, and is working to make amends for his prior mistakes. It's also worth noting that in this scene, Asgore and Toriel both wear similar outfits to the ones they wear in Deltarune. This behavior from Asgore will be crucial to take note of as we meet his Deltarune counterpart, and with that we now have a strong understanding of who Asgore is in Undertale. While there are still tons of dialogue and flavor text that can further strengthen our familiarity with Asgore, it's a bit outside of the scope of this video. The key takeaway here are that Asgore is regretful and a remorseful man, whose mistakes have greatly strained his relationship with those close to him. Asgore cares deeply for his people and is very kind-hearted and compassionate. He longs to return to a past that he will never be able to return to, and uses those memories as a form of escapism to avoid what change and action may bring. It's these aspects of Asgore's character and how his character in Deltarune retains, changes, and subverts these qualities that will help us accurately predict his role in the wider story of Deltarune. Now, with Undertale out of the way, we can finally start talking about Asgore and Deltarune. In Deltarune, Asgore has lived in a different world, and thus led a very different but somewhat similar life. First, Asgore retains his role as a former husband to Toriel and father to Azrael, as well as a father to a human. This human obviously being Chris Dreemurr. Asgore also used to hold a position of authority in Hometown, being the former chief of police, who was removed from the force after some event or action that we don't quite know about yet, but we'll get into just what that is a bit later. It also seems to be implied that whatever caused Asgore to be removed from the force may also be the source of the strain in his relationship with Toriel, or at the very least a contributing factor or the catalyst for their split. Finally, Asgore and the rest of the Dreemurrs have a close but fractured bond with the Holiday family, who as previously mentioned exist in the world of Undertale. With that brief overview, we can start looking more deeply at each of these elements. In Chapter 1, the focus given to Asgore is mostly about his separation from Toriel, his relationship with the Holiday family, and the difficult life he now leads. Regarding his and Toriel's relationship, we aren't given much context as to why the two have split in this world. Their split in Undertale was a product of the horrific actions that Asgore took in regards to the humans that fell into the underground. So it's not unreasonable to expect at this point in the story that whatever caused the split between the two was something that carried a similar weight. But without any additional evidence, it's not unreasonable to assume that the two might just not be compatible in the long term anyway. We see that Asgore has now for some time been trying to win back Toriel, similar to what we speculate he was doing in the true pacifist ending of Undertale. We know that for some time Asgore slept on the couch in the Dreemurr household before moving into his struggling flower shop called Flower King, which is obviously a direct allusion to his role in Undertale. Looking at Asgore's shop, we see inside that he has 7 colored flowers encased in glass. These flowers are intentionally reminiscent of the human souls in Undertale, 6 of which are the same color as the human souls, with the one in the center being gold, reminiscent of Flowey obviously. The glass encasement of these seems to be a reference to the containers the souls were stored in Undertale. If you look at the flowers on Asgore's fridge, you can see a picture of Asgore and Toriel at their wedding, with Rudy Holiday seemingly as his best man, where Toriel is holding a bouquet of 7 flowers. It seems that the flowers that Asgore keeps encased in glass in his shop may be the flowers from his wedding, or at least the same type of flowers. And it seems to me that he feels the need to preserve these flowers because if these flowers will undie, it would mean that his marriage died too. Furthermore, we see a locked door that, with context from future chapters, seems to lead to the basement. We can also look inside Asgore's fridge, which only contains a pickle jar with a single pickle and an egg, painting a very bleak picture of Asgore's financial situation. Finally, we see a series of papers strewn on the floor. Amongst these papers, we see a note from somebody named C, who we later learn to be Carol Holiday. This note from Carol shows that Asgore has been missing rent payments because he keeps giving away flowers instead of selling them, and she gives him a deadline of 1 month to make payments before being presumably evicted. This note shows some strain between the two, but we can talk more about the relationship between two of them later on. Quickly touching on Carol's better half though, Asgore had a strong friendship with Rudy Holiday, with them being college pals, and Rudy being his best man too, but their relationship seems to have been weakened by the falling out between the two families. Moving on to Chapter 2, we see further exploration of Asgore's relationship issues with Toriel. If you go to Sans' store in Chapter 2, we see a scene with Asgore, Toriel, and Sans. Toriel enters the store and the pair start bouncing puns off of each other, followed by Asgore entering the store and delivering his iconic ex-husband line. Toriel awkwardly exits the store after turning down flowers from Asgore, and Asgore shifts his attention to Sans. We learn that Sans has been giving Asgore the pickles we saw in his fridge for free, and asks Sans for advice on what flowers could make Toriel remember how she felt before. Sans replies that he should talk to his flowers about that, and Asgore says that he already has. The scene mostly just gives us a deeper look at Asgore's desperation to win Toriel back. But Asgore talking to his flowers is an important thing to note that we'll return to when we start talking about Chapter 5. We also get our first allusion as to what may have driven a wedge between Toriel and Asgore in Chapter 2. By interacting with a newspaper article on a bulletin board in the hometown police station, we can read an article about Undyne being promoted from rookie to police chief after Asgore Dreemurr was removed from the force. It's at this point that Chris stops reading the article, leaving us to make our best guess at what the reason for removal was. This article here is what led many to theorize back in Chapter 2 that Asgore may be responsible, involved, or being held unfairly accountable for the disappearance of the missing member of the Holiday family. Good old December Holiday. A theory that has gotten only more and more evidence since this moment and will be the crux of a lot of our expectations for Asgore's wider role in Deltarune's story. Next, Asgore doesn't make an appearance in Chapter 3, but we still get more insight into him, his separation from Toriel, and what happened between the Dreemurrs and the Holidays. First, throughout the chapter, Tenna gives us several insights into the relationship between Toriel and Asgore. During the Lenino and Lenina battle, when the couple begins to fight, Tenna says, "It's normal for couples to fight sometimes. Come on, Chris, tell him." Later in the chapter, Tenna says, "The family's fighting again," which seems to indicate that fights were quite frequent in the Dreemurr household. Finally, towards the end of the chapter, we see more evidence for Asgore being involved in the disappearance of Des. When Tenna reflects on the time he used to be watching the Dreemurr residence, we're met with a scene of the living room of the Dreemurr household at Christmas time. In this scene, we see silhouettes of Chris, Azriel, Noelle, December, Toriel, Asgore, Rudy, and Carol. When Tenna starts talking about how people start coming to watch him, we see the silhouettes begin to fade away in the following order. First, Des leaves, followed by Carol, Asgore, Noelle, Rudy, Azriel, Chris, and finally, Toriel. With this, we can infer why each person leaves. First, we can presume that Des fades first because she goes missing. Carol quickly stops going to the Dreemurr's house after this, presumably because he holds Asgore responsible for what happened. At the same time, Des's disappearance causes a schism between Asgore and Toriel, and thus leads to Asgore moving out of the Dreemurr household. Next, Noelle likely stops going because Carol doesn't want her to, but Rudy keeps coming back for some time by himself before the rift between the family grows so large that he no longer wants to keep going. Then, Azriel either leaves for college or takes Des's disappearance harshly enough to stop engaging in this family activity, and thus Chris quickly stops using the TV after their brother stops. Finally, Toriel continues to use the TV alone for some time before eventually just unplugging it. This simple detail of the order in which characters disappear tells an entire story on its own and shows very clearly that Des's disappearance is the spark for much of the strain between the two families. Finally, moving on to Chapter 4, we learn from Father Alvin that Asgore attends the church at night, praying for Azriel, Toriel, Rudy, and his flowers. We also find out that Toriel appreciates that Carol has been providing Asgore with financial support, but wishes that she didn't support his you-know-what. Furthermore, we learn that Toria has lit a prayer candle for Asgore, showing that although she may reject his advances and not want to be with him anymore, her distaste for him probably doesn't run as deep as it did in Undertale. We run into Asgore when leaving the church. Although it might be more aptly described as an ambush, Asgore was waiting for Toriel to leave the church from the bushes so that he could give her more flowers. It becomes clear that Asgore's desperation has grown to the point where he is actively thinking about when he can force a run with Toriel for another attempt to try and win her back. After this scene, we can talk to Ice Wolf as he's decorating Town Hall, and he mentions that he's decorating with flowers purchased from the Flower King. He says he was ordered to do so by the mayor, saying that it's nice business for the Flower Man. This shows that despite Carol's icy demeanor, she may have authentic concern for Asgore. Since it was Ice Wolf who bought the flowers, she may be using him as a proxy purchaser to give Asgore the money he needs to pay the rent he owes her, without making him believe that she's outright allowing him to stay without paying. Moving forward, we can meet a character outside of Asgore's shop who says the following. That Asgore guy, it's a shame he lost everything after he, now he has to sell flowers to make ends meet. But, what? He's your father? Sorry, well I hope for your sake he quits being so obsessed with this stuff. When we check the back door in Chapter 4, we can see through the basement window. In there, we see a corkboard with tons of paper and documents littering the floor. This description seems to match an evidence board, and it's not hard to assume that it's related to Des's disappearance. When we get to Noelle's house in Chapter 4, we can find Asgore wearing cleaning equipment, cleaning the holiday residence, and the scene goes as follows. This scene shows that Asgore has something to settle, and that the work he is doing by cleaning the house is a part of it. He then resolves to go look again and leaves the room. We can then find him in Noelle's parents' room where he delivers some more dialogue. With this scene, we now get far more context as to what exactly Asgore did, and by extension, more context as to what may have happened to December. Asgore seems to have taken some kind of action that was necessary from his perspective due to a perceived danger, but nobody in town, Toriel included, believes him. We know that this is what caused the rift in their relationship, as Asgore is convinced it will be mended if he can prove something. Finally, Asgore appears to be holding a black shard, which is an item that we can obtain by beating the knight in Chapter 3, and is a shard of the black knife, the knight's sword. If we look into the game files, we can see in this room that there is a black katana leaning against the wall in front of Asgore. Some believe that Asgore is talking about the katana in the scene, and it may very well be the case. However, it would be quite strange to refer to a whole katana as a shard. You could also consider that if Death is a knight, and the knight is made of the same material as a black knife, it's possible that the black shard could be a shard of Death herself, and it's all he could find at the site she went missing. What could be implied by this scene is that Asgore fell into a dark world and fought the knight, perhaps being a freshly transformed December holiday, unbeknownst to Asgore himself, of course. The knight, being a formidable opponent, would create the threat necessary for Asgore to take some action that would endanger December if he believed it imperative to save lives. Whilst there is a multitude of ideas that this action could be, such as sealing the shelter to entrap the knight despite December being aside, the action doesn't matter so much as the result. Asgore takes some action to protect his hometown, which is related to or causes the disappearance of December holiday, likely in a situation that involves Dark World and the knight. With this knowledge, several pieces of the puzzle start to fall into place. It explains why he's so desperate to win Toriel back, because he experienced some supernatural event that ripped his life apart. It also explains that his obsession, mentioned by Toriel and by the citizens of Hometown, is an obsession with a cold case that he can't let go of. One that makes him appear to be a conspiracy nut, trying to prove the existence of Dark Worlds. Finally, we have a few more teasers in Chapter 4 to quickly recap before moving on to Chapter 5. First, we see this section of the Jackenstein fight, where each of these icons seems to correlate to a chapter or chapter boss. The final chapter boss in this is a flower, likely alluding to the boss of Chapter 5. Next, in Gerson's secret boss fight, he says, Chapter 5, the Field of Pink and Gold. The vast garden is charred in Inferno of Jealousy. While there is a lot of speculation about what the Inferno of Jealousy is, we can at least connect the pink and gold mentioned to the color scheme of both Asgore and his flower shop. And the garden is an obvious indicator for a Flower King Dark World as well. Going back to Chapter 3 for a moment, we learn from the man that on Sundays he harvests the wheat, matching this description of a plant-based Dark World. At last, we can find a prophecy panel in the third sanctuary. This panel says, "The Flower Man trapped in asylum," and shows Asgore with a crown and a flower, with his depiction being reminiscent of his design in Undertale. It's also important to note that this prophecy panel is called a boss prophecy in the code, matching the naming scheme for the prophecy panels about Tenna and Queen. And with this encompasses everything we've seen with Asgore from Chapter 1 to Chapter 4 of Deltarune. Asgore is a clear reflection of his Undertale counterpart, and with his ties to Carol in December, he's been catapulted into a critically important character in Deltarune. Now that we have a full understanding of Asgore across both Undertale and the first 4 chapters of Deltarune, we're finally equipped to start talking about Asgore's role in Chapter 5, and Deltarune's wider narrative. Leading off from the teasers we got in Chapter 5, it's extremely safe to say that Asgore's shop, Flower King, will be the location of the Chapter 5 Dark World, or at least a part of it. Given Asgore's depiction of the prophecy panel, the name of his shop, as well as how Toriel's Dark World form manifests, it's almost certain that Asgore will be the Flower King of the Chapter 5's Dark World. and we can probably expect a character design derivative of his design in Undertale, but perhaps refreshed or rethemed to reflect the flower portion of his namesake. This, in tandem with the prophecy panel sprite being labeled as a boss image, has led many to believe that Asgore himself will be the boss of the Chapter 5 Dark World. There is a compelling case to be made here, obviously. He's the king of this world, so it follows that he would be the authority figure in this world, just like King, Queen, and Tenna. However, context around this situation makes such a straightforward interpretation fairly dicey, especially with how Toby has teased future chapters, often subverting the most straightforward interpretations without making it feel like you've been lied to, such as Chris making the Chapter 3 Dark World because they work for the Knight rather than being the Knight themselves. Toby has also been mindful that his games are going to be examined under a microscope, and I don't fully believe he would just give us the Chapter 5 boss so we could exhaust every possible Asgore boss interpretation before we get the chance to play it in a year. Asgore being the chapter boss would just be way more fun to me as an entirely in-game reveal. Sure, we got tons of foreshadowing for Gerson, but a few could have envisioned him as a secret boss of Chapter 4, nor was it with the most obvious interpretation of that foreshadowing in my opinion. Furthermore, it's hard to imagine many contexts in which Asgore could be driven to fight their child. Let's not kid ourselves here. The guy isn't unfamiliar with turning kids into corpses, but his child and their friends? Come on. To be completely fair though, some interpretations can work here, especially ones where Asgore loses some or all of his agency, but for now I'd like to consider some other options. Let's circle back to Asgore's prophecy panel. The Flower Man trapped in Asylum. In this image we see two subjects, Asgore and a flower, presumably the golden flower from his shop. Considering the golden flower to be the chapter's boss allows us to make some very interesting interpretations. The text may refer to the flower itself as the Flower Man, and the trapped in Asylum portion may refer to how the flowers are encased in glass in Asgore's shop. However, I still think that the prophecy here refers to Asgore himself, so under the assumption that Asgore is the Flower Man, what does being trapped in Asylum actually refer to? Especially with the context of the Golden Flower being the chapter's boss. Well, I think Asgore will be somewhat of a figurehead rather than the authority in this Dark World. Instead, that power will lie within the Golden Flower. The Flower themselves will view Asgore as somewhat of a father figure, and take care of him the same way he takes care of them. Since we know Asgore often speaks to the flowers almost as a form of therapy, they'll be very aware of his needs. The world will likely heavily draw from nostalgia as a form of escapism and will use elements from Asgore's past to create his perfect life. As an added note, I think that the world will also draw heavily from Undertale as a whole to invoke those same feelings to the player. Returning to Asgore, I believe this illusory perfect world will be shattered once Asgore tries to leave the Dark World. Much like how Asgore is overbearingly protective of the flowers, going as far as to encase them in glass, the flowers will keep him in the Dark World due to them inheriting his preservationist qualities. Also, due to the selfish desire that we'll talk more about momentarily. From then on, he'll remain the Flower King, but his role will be much clearer as a prisoner in this place rather than the leader. This would be what the Trapped in Asylum would refer to, with Asgore being stuck in a world composed of his memories and desires, figuratively stuck in his head. This parallels his role in Undertale as a king of prison, and his tendency to live and escape into his memories. Now, so far we've only discussed the flowers as to how they pertain to Asgore, but what is the flowers' desire beyond Asgore? Well, to put it simply, I think they desire to live. The flowers exist in a strange in-between of Darkner and Lightner. Plants are animate living creatures and thus would be considered Lightners. We see an example of this in Chapter 3 with a cactus in the upstairs hallway of the Dreemurr house. When you talk to them whilst they're behind a curtain in the S-rank room, they say, "Can I look like this? Can I dream like this?" Given we see no normal Darkner act like this, it would seem to imply that they aren't familiar with having a Dark World form, and that they're only exposed to the layer of existence that current Darkners exist in when a Dark Fountain is opened. However, you could also say that they are more Darkner than Lightner, as they likely do not have the same level of consciousness in the Light World, or perhaps none at all, if we abide by real-world science. Since they live in this weird limbo, we'll see them express something that we've only really seen so far with RALSEI and Spamton, the desire to exist in the Light World the same way they do in the Dark World. This will be at least one of the aspects of the Inferno of Jealousy mentioned by Gerson during Chapter 4, with the flowers being jealous of the Lightner's ability to be fully conscious in the Light World, and more specifically, Chris and their ability to have a relationship with Asgore. They may even unfairly criticize Chris's distance from Asgore, as they are only privy to Asgore's account of whatever has torn his life apart. Since this motivation is something they'll share with RALSEI, it offers rich potential for exploring his desire to exist in the Light World, especially since Chapter 5 will take place during Hometown's festival. a time when he'll be feeling especially down and lonely about not being able to attend with his friends. Overall, the Dark World being a haven for Asgore and the flowers embodying Asgore's preservationist qualities, as well as sharing RALSEI's desire to exist in the light world, but responding in anger rather than sadness, offers a lot of potential for Deltarune's themes of nostalgia, impermanence, and acceptance. Now that we've covered the flowers, let's focus a bit more on RALSEI and how he fits into this wider narrative with Asgore and the flowers. Let's start by setting the stage a little bit for the chapter by using the wider structure of Deltarune to shape the structure of the chapter. First, we're pretty damn sure that Noelle is bound to show up again in the future Dark World. She's got a whole ton of dialogue for all the new equipment that was added in chapters 3 and 4, and unless we think Toby added a bunch of unique interactions, small mechanics, and flavor text just to mess with our expectations, it's safe to say that we'll see her again in a Dark World. Furthermore, as we saw on Deltarune.com/chapter 5, the 5 on the page was substantially bigger than the 4, and if that truly does refer to the amount of content in each chapter's weird route, it almost certainly means that we see Noelle show up in a Dark World in the weird route. Additionally, we know that in the normal route, Noelle will be on a date with Susie, so it follows that events unfolding have her end up with us in the Dark World as well. Finally, if you subscribe to the idea that Chapter 5 will massively change the status quo of Deltarune, whether that be the start of the Roaring or some other large event as supported by both the eggs and shadow crystals either wrapping up or entering some new phase, then Noelle must learn that the Dark Worlds were real, and get more development time with a fun gang in this chapter before that event. As for composing the party for this chapter, it's nearly a given that Chris will be in the party as our vessel, so it's just a matter of whether the third is Susie or RALSEI. Given that Susie and Noelle's relationship will likely get heavy focus in the chapter, leading up to or following their date during the festival, it follows logically that Susie is the third party member for this chapter. Furthermore, when we consider each character's battle role, Noelle's and RALSEI's abilities make them a much easier swap from a gameplay perspective. So what does that mean for RALSEI during this chapter if he's the odd one out for the party composition? Well, if we look at this Toby Fox tweet, we might get some idea. Tweeted on May 13th of 2020, the tweet reads, "RALSEI shirt, he's always getting mixed up with flowers, isn't he?" That hasn't happened yet. I believe that this was a tongue-in-cheek teaser from Toby, and that we'll see that come to pass in this chapter. Now, we won't go over all of them, but RALSEI has tons of small parallels with Flowey, especially when you consider them as somewhat alternate or twisted versions of Asriel. It's possible that RALSEI somehow infiltrates a castle disguised as a flower, orders some hijinks, and RALSEI's visual similarity to a boss monster, RALSEI gets kidnapped and is imprisoned with Asgore. It may even be that the flowers in the Dark World take on the form of boss monsters due to their connection with Asgore, but that's not something we can provide any evidence for. This would be the first time someone familiar with Asriel sees RALSEI in a context where the similarities between the two have to be addressed, and I think that Chapter 5 is where the shoe will finally drop on these connections. It's also possible that Asgore will be so deluded or confused that he assumes RALSEI to be Asriel, which would tie into RALSEI's identity issues and his desire to create his own. I don't think that the purpose of this dynamic would be that of mentor and student, like Chris and Susie. Instead, I think Asgore will learn qualities like acceptance from RALSEI. On the other hand, I think that RALSEI, who is used to just following others around, will try to do the same with Asgore. But Asgore's plans won't play out the way they're supposed to, and this will force RALSEI into a situation where he must think and act on his own. Now, all of this can't happen off screen, of course, and with Chris as our vessel in this world, I believe that throughout the chapter, Chris will force us to think about RALSEI, whilst they further the holiday agenda off screen, in a similar way to how they forcefully sent us to Susie in Chapter 4 as a means to locate her during the Sound of Justice fight. Furthermore, I believe that the chapter's secret boss will work in the same way. The last two, well, arguably the last three, secret bosses have been heavily linked to specific members of the Fun Gang. Spamton and Chris are both puppets, and Chris has an intense reaction when Spamton's string are cut. Though the fighting route gives you a weapon for RALSEI, the sword route seems to be heavily tied to a dark past for Chris, with ERAM directly calling them out, and Chris having obvious ties to the Knight, as well as the fight producing a weapon that only Chris can use. Finally, Susie and Gerson have a big mentor-student dynamic throughout the chapter, which culminates with a big lesson from Gerson if you complete that secret boss. That makes RALSEI the only person who hasn't had their secret boss yet. Assuming that pattern holds, we'll complete the quest to reach the secret boss while playing as Chris, and once that is completed, we'll have an option to think of RALSEI. This will allow us to have a RALSEI-only secret boss, without being too derivative of Susie's secret boss. As for the secret bosses themselves, there is a huge multitude of candidates, so for the sake of time, we'll only briefly look at 3. Our first candidate is Asgore himself, which would make for a very interesting fight to have a rematch with an Undertale character, especially with a chapter drawing a ton from escapism through nostalgia. Our next candidate is Sans, who shares all of the same qualities as the Asgore fight with a bonus of the Blue Soul mode, which he may even discover during the battle. Now the only problem with these two candidates is that they feel a little derivative of Gerson, where the battle will be to teach RALSEI something. In practice, I don't think most would care if the fight was just that, because they'd make for really awesome fights, but we do still have other options. The final candidate we'll discuss here is Friend. It would be awesome to give RALSEI someone who we presume to be a genuine threat, and if their connections to Gasser are true, then it may create a really interesting fight where they can break game logic and do unique attacks. Also, if the fight works like the other thinking of fights, it may be that we aren't able to command RALSEI and that we're only able to dodge, adding another unique mechanic to the fight. Finally, if we really can't command RALSEI in the fight, it'd be interesting if he chooses not to attack. Whilst RALSEI has no issues with attacking the Titans, they aren't quite conscious, so it may explore RALSEI's struggle with violence as a means to progress. It could also be that Friend is a foil to RALSEI and that they both serve a similar role to the Lightners. RALSEI has been almost like a guiding light throughout the dark, shaping our morality and putting some of the elements of the prophecy into motion. Let's consider Friend to be a parallel to RALSEI. That may be reflected in their guiding Des and possibly Chris to the bunker, setting the story into motion and perhaps drying out the violent tendencies that we see Chris repress during the Eram fight. The freedom theme in this fight would be explored through Friend as a willing participant in the prophecy against RALSEI, someone who has followed the prophecy somewhat but still wants it to change. It's this potential dichotomy between the two characters that makes Friend fight a very compelling choice for this fight, and would give observant players much to talk about Friend's role in the past and future of Deltarune. Overall, having RALSEI and Asgore share screen time together in Chapter 5 offers a fantastic opportunity to be able to deeply explore both their characters and has a great deal of potential for creating a memorable character dynamic. Now, we talked a bit before about potential actions Asgore may have taken that resulted in or contributed to Des's disappearance, and I believe that we'll find out the precise answer in this chapter. I think that as we progress through the chapter, we'll come across various echo flowers, each one containing a conversation from Asgore. I think that these will have odd cutoffs or muffled words, ones that are intended to mislead the player and the party to incorrect conclusions about what happened to Des. The missing words will make it seem as though Asgore is fully culpable for what happened to December, before a reveal towards the end of the chapter that he wasn't at fault. Furthermore, I believe that the flower shop's basement, which contains the evidence board and various documents littered in the ground, will encompass the final area of the chapter, or that small tidbits of this will be strewn throughout the chapter along the echo flowers. This will be the most straightforward introduction of Des as the missing holiday girl and will lead to a night reveal at the end of the chapter. This will be the first time Susie learns about December, and it will be very interesting to see Noelle relive these events and explain them to Susie. It will also be interesting to see if we can get any reaction from Chris during these moments, as they are working with the Knight and there has been some implication that they may have been responsible for what happened to Des, perhaps even more than Asgore. Overall, having Asgore, a character majorly tied to Des' disappearance, and his flower shop, which is not only his own but base of operations for the search for Des, being such a major focus of the chapter will be the perfect build-up to a December night reveal. Now that we've got all the pieces, we need to look at how they all come together at the end of the chapter. I believe that we'll get into a fight with the golden flower, or possibly all of the flowers. In this fight, they'll be fighting for Asgore and talking about how the people in Asgore's life don't appreciate him like they do. We could also see the various soul modes tied to each flower color during this fight. I think at the end of the fight, Asgore will interrupt. After a full chapter of having a world composed of his memories catered to his desires not be quite what it's cracked up to be, and possibly with some clarity that he developed with RALSEI, he'll finally be able to confront the truth. That even if he can prove to Toriel that what he did was necessary to save the town, they just won't be something like a big happy family again. That time has passed and he can't just keep diving into his memory of how good things were and hoping that Toriel will do the same. He'll also see past his idealized memories and realize that things may not have been as perfect as he remembered, and that the fighting began long before anything happened, and that Des' disappearance was just a straw that broke the camel's back. This will be a direct parallel of the uninterrupted version of his monologue at the end of Undertale. After hearing this, the battle will end and the flowers will have some kind of resolution with Asgore and be happy to move into Castletown. Even if they can't be in the light world, just as the flowers and their preservation are symbolic of Asgore's desperation to hold on to his marriage, the flowers going to Castletown will be symbolic of him letting go of his marriage and moving on. Now, with the main narrative of the chapter wrapped up, we'll finally get to see what Chris has been preparing off-screen, and the Knight will make their grand entrance. Asgore, having already faced the Knight before, will immediately jump in front of the Fun Gang to protect them. They'll battle. However, the Knight is much stronger than what they once fought. and with Asgore focused on defending the Fun Gang, the Knight will have no problem taking care of Asgore. Just as the Knight is about to go in for a knockout punch, the Flowers will restrain the Knight in a very similar way as to how Flowery restrained everyone in the true pacifist ending of Undertale. In this moment, the Knight will make a distinct mannerism that will cause all the pieces to come together in Noelle's head. This is when we'll finally have the Knight reveal, and we'll get to see how the Fun Gang and Asgore react to this. Asgore will have mixed feelings. He'll be happy he's finally found Des, and he'll have been proven right. However, he's already accepted that his marriage is over at this point, and he'll be deeply devastated to see what's become of Des. After the Knight's identity is revealed, she'll flee the Dark World and seal the Great Door behind her. After explaining the situation to Asgore, he'll give us the police section of the code needed to enter the bunker. This will conclude Asgore's role in Chapter 5's Dark World, but afterwards we'll see him apologize to Toriel, and he'll appear to be a lot happier and content, and Toriel will be a lot more open to Asgore as a friend. With this, Asgore's main role in Deltarune's role, well, it'll be complete, and with it too will most of Undertale characters' plotlines just before we get to the end game. Now that we've finally realized Asgore's role in Chapter 5, what impact does this have on the rest of Deltarune? Well, first, we've already discussed how many of his traits and actions apply to the game's themes of escapism, impermanence, and acceptance, as well as how he indirectly strengthens the theme of identity through RALSEI and the Flowers. However, I believe Asgore also has a role as an important parallel to Mayor Holiday. Mayor Holiday is the ultimate authority in the hometown, just as Asgore was the ultimate authority in the underground. They both have had a tragedy that tore their families apart, with Asgore having the incident with the fallen human and Asriel in Undertale, and both having been affected by the tragedy of December Holiday in Deltarune. Asgore tries desperately to rebuild his family in Deltarune, and it follows that this is the goal Mayor Holiday is also working towards with Chris and Des. In Chapter 4, when talking about the Holiday House, Susie mentions that it's kinda like the holidays just got frozen in place. While Susie is specifically referring to how the house is Christmas themed despite it not being Christmas time, it's obvious from the wording that this is meant to apply to the Holiday family themselves, who've also been stuck after Des' disappearance. This is similar to what happened to Asgore after the passing of his children in Undertale, lying in wait, completely absorbed by a life that will never return to him. Whilst Asgore embodies escapism through nostalgia, Carol finds escapism in her work. She's constantly working, and I expect it is how she deals with troubling things in her life, like Des' disappearance and Rudy's sickness. It's her inability to confront these emotions directly that has given her such a cold demeanor. Finally, they both have a fixation on preservation and are overly protective. Asgore goes to great lengths to preserve his flowers, encasing them in glass so they cannot wilt away. On the other hand, Carol goes as far as the bronze paper snowflakes, such that they don't wear out over time. You could also extend this to December's room, but it's a pretty common thing for parents with missing or deceased children to do. Also, I believe that the strictness that Carol shows to Noelle is from a place of being overprotective rather than being malicious. These qualities will be the biggest thing that Carol has to confront in the story, that maybe by the end of it she won't be able to save Des or Rudy, and that she'll need to confront these issues healthily and be there for her daughter throughout it. Before Toby gets to tell us that story, he chose to explore these themes with a character from his previous work, giving him a great opportunity to strengthen that character and greatly enhance the story of his current work. In conclusion, Asgore will be an extremely important character in Deltarune. We've identified Asgore's key trait of escapism through nostalgia throughout both Undertale and Deltarune, a full exploration of how that will manifest in the rest of Deltarune, and his ties and parallels to Carol Holiday, who's also shaping up to be a key character in Deltarune. Whether the particular ideas put forward in this video come to pass in the game or not, the analysis of Asgore and the evidence and themes used for the predictions should still prove pretty useful for anyone trying to predict what the future of Deltarune will bring for Asgore. So what do you think? Is Asgore actually the chapter's boss? Just what did he do to protect his hometown that caused December's disappearance? Do you still think that he may not even be that important to Deltarune after all? Let us know in the comments below, but thanks again for watching. We hope to see you all again in the future for more Deltarune theories and analysis.